Okay, this is going to be lecture two. Apologies. This is going to be lecture two. We'll talk about some basic economics. This will be about market failures. And then they have a section on behavioral failures or behavioral anomalies, but we'll kind of just stick to the economics for the most part. All right, so section 2.1 Intro to Market Failures. There are 5 conditions you need for a healthy market under sort of capitalist theory, right? Free market theory. The first is that you must have several producers and several consumers, right? This is competition. Uh, when you get one producer, you have a monopoly. A handful, you have an oligopoly. And when you have one buyer, you have what's called a monopsony. So we'll talk about all those in a minute. Number two, the product or service must be homogeneous, right? It can't be something special or different, right? They need to be comparable products. So, gasoline obviously is pretty much the same across the board, regardless of who refines it. Now, there are differences in oil, right? There's sort of clean oil and dirty oil. Um, it sort of depends on purity. But places like Canada, Saudi Arabia, U.S. in Midland and Odessa tend to have really clean oil. But there are sort of dirty barrels of oil like those that come out of Venezuela generally. They're a lot more viscous, it's less pure, etc. So there are differences, and there are different prices depending on which type of oil it is. But for the most part, oil is oil as long as it's the sort of high purity. They sell it by the 55 gallon barrel. Um, yeah, okay. So number three, full information for producers and consumers. This is generally an assumption that is made in economic theory, especially for the ease of things like modeling, right? Whenever you want to model out behavioral paths or behavioral analysis or these sorts of things, you sort of assume that producers and consumers have full information, right? Number four, neither consumer nor producer may influence the price. It is left to simple supply and demand forces, right? Um, and that kind of touches on number one. You have to have several producers and consumers. Whenever you move into the realm of oligopoly or monopoly, things get weird, right? And that's not free market. Okay, and then number five is we assume utility maximizing rationality. And if you've never taken an economics course or some of my upper level courses, rationality does not mean what it means in psychology, right? In economics, rationality just means benefit maximization, right? Or utility maximization. It's about cost benefit analysis. And it is about making inevitably the choice that maximizes your utility out of a random number of choices, right? You will always pick the utility maximizing choice, right? Now, obviously, humans aren't always this way, and even corporations aren't always this way. But again, this is one of those sort of assumptions that we make to simplify the models in economics and rational choice theory. Okay, so what are some of the potential causes of market failures? One, we have externalities. This can mean a lot of different things. First, think like global externalities like conflict, extreme weather, hurricanes, a typhoon, pandemic, obviously. These sorts of things can be externalities that will affect the market. But we also have externalities like legislation and regulation, right? Um, these limit the behaviors that the producers can. It limits their behavioral options, I guess I would say, right? So it's not pure free market. Regulation and legislation tend to be thought of as externalities, right? Um, How far we go on these is sort of up to your own philosophical perspective, right? But I would argue at least some legislation is necessary, right? Like you don't want toxic chemicals being dumped into rivers or just dumped on the ground, right? You want labor safety laws, you want minimum age requirements to be an employee. You don't want little kids in there. Um, we need some semblance of environmental protection, right? So again, we can argue about how far we should go or how short we should go, but I think there's at least some basic regulations that are obviously necessary. Okay, another potential cause of a market failure is what we think of as a common good or a public good or a common resource, right? These can be things like parks. It can be national land that's been set aside as a sort of nature reserve, or like Yellowstone, right? Um, but they generally tend to lead to what's called these thought experiments, and one of the more famous ones is the tragedy of the commons, right? So consider a bunch of fishermen or even sheep herders. Uh, the fishermen have a lake that they have to share, and so every fisherman has a individualized incentive to take as many fish as they can from the lake at all times, right? To maximize their own profits and utility. Unfortunately, this can lead to overfishing, right? And so, as a group, we might have different incentives to regulate how many fish are taken out so that we can ensure that our stock remains supplied over time, right? And so this will generally need some semblance of an agreement between the members, right? So this can be just sort of an unspoken agreement or a handshake kind of thing. It can be laws or institutions. And it often involves some sort of monitoring system to ensure that no one is cheating or free riding, as we call it in economics. Um, I would also point out here that there has actually been some successful movement at the global scale on these sorts of things, right? Because like the atmosphere is considered a public resource or a public good, right? And so when we had problems with what are called chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs in the late 80s and 90s, or things like acid rain, where the acidification of the water molecules in the clouds was becoming so pH unbalanced that when it fell, it would acidify lakes and rivers and kill organisms, right? But we were able to do this. We were able to fix these common problems across the entire planet, basically, using some of these monitoring systems, institutions, new international laws, etc. And the globe has, for the most part, moved away completely from CFC usage. And so there are some successful examples to be pointed out. This energy politics stuff sometimes can be a little bit, I guess, depressing or pessimistic, right? But there have been movements in the past that have worked. So if you're interested in that sort of thing and you're interested in sort of um, greenhouse gas emissions and how we might reduce them, that might be some case studies that you go back and look into and learn, okay, well, what worked in getting rid of things like CFC so that the ozone at the north and south poles sort of rebuilt themselves over time. Okay, another sort of market problem or market failure is asymmetric or unavailable information, right? And this is when either producers or consumers have a lack of information on things like alternatives and alternative products, pricing standards, efficiency standards, corporate practices, environmental harms, all of these sorts of things, right? Um, and this can lead to sort of the principal agent problem, where you have different goals or different incentives between the principal and the agent, or say the seller and the buyer, right? The seller is going to have very different incentives than the purchaser of oil products, right? Um, yeah, so this can become a bit of a problem, and this is a big critique of sort of rational choice theories, that they assume perfect information in their models, but generally that's not really how the world works, right? Okay, market failure number 4 is lack of competition. So this is a big one. And this is one that actually, at least under leftist administrations recently in the United States, there's been a little bit of movement on trying to bring back some of this sort of, monopoly busting, or that sort of thing, right? Breaking up of companies and holding them responsible, and ensuring there actually is sort of fair competition in the market, right? So they've gone after companies like Amazon and others. There are big concerns about the new sort of media mergers that are happening under the Trump administration, because they're going way over what the FCC has said would be the limit of sort of media control, and so these sorts of things, right? Because we've moved in the era of sort of globalism and neoliberalization, right? At least since the Reagan era, we've seen a lot of agglomeration in corporate industry, right? Lots and lots of buyouts, lots and lots of mergers, and there are concerns that this is reducing competition, causing things like collusion between companies and fixing of prices, and these sorts of things, right? Um, and so you have a lot of different types of lack of competition in the market theoretically. Obviously, you have monopolies, right? And arguably, there are some monopolies in the oil industry, right? And the refinement side is pretty tight. I mean, I wouldn't say monopoly, but maybe like an oligopoly. You have regional sort of monopolies when it comes to distribution of the finished product, like gasoline. And this is because of the extraordinary expenditures that they have to build for the refinement facilities and for the piping. Because a lot of this stuff doesn't move by trucks, it moves regionally through piping systems, right? And then once it gets really close to the gas station, they'll sort of truck it in from there. Okay, you have monopsonies, right? This is when you have a single purchaser, and arguably, this could be like the nuclear industry if we're talking about energy, because most Western states that have nuclear power plants, excuse me, the government is the sole purchaser, right? And you could argue that, the energy purchasers, like the consumers, the people who are using their air conditioner at their house, or companies or whatever, are the purchasers, but for the most part, the government is the one purchasing energy, and sometimes they can put restrictions on pricing, right? Oligopolies are a problem. This is not quite a monopoly, but it's usually when there's only, say, I don't know, 2 to 6 competitors on the scene, right? And so this would be probably a good description of the oil industries, at least the extraction side, with companies like Exxon and BP and Shell Mobil, et cetera, as basically the only major players on the scene. You also There's an argument to be made about OPEC, right? At least, especially during a period about 50 to 60 years ago when they were first coming on the scene, and they were by far the world's biggest producers of petroleum products. And so the world has done a pretty good job of strategizing how to reduce the power of OPEC, by introducing new oil reserves and pulling from multiple spots around the world, and trying to sort of divest from a completely Middle Eastern petroleum platform, right? Um, and so OPEC's power has been reduced over time, yes, but they are still pretty powerful. And at the moment, they're sort of flooding the market with a little bit more product to bring the prices down, to kind of get at Trump a little bit, who's a at least that's what a lot of reporters are reporting. because Trump is very pro oil industry, right? And so, yes, while these things, while lower prices are good for consumers, right, as for our wallet, it's not really great for our region, right? And once you pass a spot at around, I don't know, 65 to maybe $58 a barrel for a 55-gallon drum, it starts becoming like negative profit, right? You start losing money by extracting it from the ground. So there's this really touchy spot around $60 a barrel where a lot of oil companies go, shit, maybe we need to stop pulling it up out of the ground until prices go up, right? And so we've seen major cuts in oil industry employment over the last 3 or 4 months as they expect this to get worse. So we'll keep an eye on that next on this class. All right, you also have things like collusion, right? This is where companies come together to agree on a set standard price, generally to gouge the public, right? And again, OPEC could probably be pointed out here. You have price fixing. So that can happen under collusion or oligopoly or whatever. But it can also happen by states, right? Especially in places like South America and especially under leftist governments. Um, they will force utility companies to sell for less than profit to keep their citizens happy, right? So Saudi Arabia does this with gasoline. You know, countries like Iraq do the same, where they charge like maybe 25 cents or 50 cents for a gallon of gasoline or whatever, like way under the actual price. But then also like electrical utilities will be forced to sell for underprice. And again, generally, this is leftist governments that sort of do this. Um, you also have supply constraints or flooding, right? And you know this isn't necessarily a market failure, but it does affect obviously the price of gasoline and the price of petroleum products, etc. Where again, OPEC has recently been sort of flooding the system a little bit, but they have also had points in the past where they pulled back production dramatically to get the prices way up, right? Um, and then finally, they add behavioral anomalies. This is a very, very new field of economics. Um, and I honestly, I don't know a whole lot about it. This has only really come on the scene in the last 15 years or so. And so we're going to stick to sort of the base theories that we've had for 100 years or more. And I'll let you guys read up on that kind of stuff. All right. Section 2.2, market failures. So we'll go through a couple of these. I tried to give really good examples above, though. Um, we should know that public goods, we'll hit definitions pretty hard, right? Because you need to learn the language of the discipline. So public goods have two rules basically. First, they have to be non-excludable, right? Like everyone owns them. Again, this might be like a park or a lake or the atmosphere, obviously, these sorts of things. And it has to be non-rivalrous, right? So if I'm using it, doesn't mean you can't use it, right? That's about it there. Okay, section 2.3.2, the role of governments in adaptation strategies. Again, since this is a political science course, we'll hit this section pretty hard. Um, there are many, many, many different roles that the government can play in energy politics and energy markets, right? So the first I would point out is infrastructure. So we have pipelines shipping oil. You've got transportation, which the government can often subsidize. You have railroad systems, obviously. The interstate highway system has an effect on these markets, right, when it comes to transport and supply. You have ports, which America's kind of falling behind a little bit on this, on expanding our port systems for the new sort of mega ships that exist. Um, You have refinement facilities. Often the government will help to subsidize these facilities in some way. You have drilling and all the science behind the drilling. So that is going to take, all the science behind this stuff comes from usually federally funded college research or university system research, this sort of thing. You have physical environmental construction, so things like dams and levees and things of that sort. Okay. The second, obviously, is going to be like pollution policies, right? So again, this is sort of a excuse me, my back is killing me. This is going to be on the side of regulations and this sort of thing. So again, this decreases how quote unquote free market the system is when they put in these sorts of policies, right? And remember, like someone has to pay these costs one way or another, right? It can be either the company paying the cost by cleaning up the exhaust or um, bringing in efficiencies or disposing of their waste properly, these sorts of things. Or on the other side, it can be sort of societal cost where the citizens of the country just deal with what are called the negative externalities of the production, right? Breathing in poor air, having poor or impure water systems, these sorts of things. So there will be costs one way or another. And so the idea behind these policies is to ensure that the companies are actually paying the costs instead of everyday citizens, right? And so some pollution policies, at least in the US, are the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. These came under the early Nixon administration. I would point out that Nixon was a Republican, right? A conservative. And the Republican Party used to be very sort of pro environmental in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this really changed in the 80s under Reagan when the sort of oil companies basically tied themselves to the Republican Party and vice versa, right? And that's when you saw a lot of pushback on things like climate change and environmental regulations and all of these sorts of things, right? But a lot of these sort of original acts of environmentalism came from conservatives. Remember, they like being outdoors, they like hunting, they like nature, they don't want to see all their hunting grounds destroyed, these sorts of things, right? Um, okay, you also have things like natural reserves and the argument in places like Yellowstone or, say, Alaska over whether we should preserve the land or whether we should tap the resources under them. So that's always a political decision, too, that can affect the markets, right? Things like purity standards, right? When you go to the gas pump and you see the 87, 89, 91, right? Those are purity standards, right? And so obviously the more expensive 91 is a little bit more pure and probably better for your engine than the 87 or 86 or whatever it might be. But also purity standards on, products, um, um, what are they called? Man, I don't know why I'm blanking here, so we'll move on. Okay, we have waste product management, right? So, what do we do with things like nuclear waste? What do we do with the effluent from petroleum refinement? These sorts of things. And a lot of times, companies are trying to figure out ways that they can actually sell that stuff too, right? Because sometimes there can actually be uses for some of the sort of wastage material that gets produced. That's not always the case, right? And so at that point, the government can step in and say, look, we need you to deal with this efficiently and effectively so that it doesn't creep into our groundwater or these sorts of things, right? And that's one of the biggest problems with nuclear waste is what the hell do we do with it, right? Like it's going to be radioactive for a million bajillion years, basically. Like the half life on that stuff is forever. And so, what do we do with it at this point? We're just kind of like locking it up in metal underground bunkers, but like that's not a great long term strategy, it doesn't seem. And then another one is the government can introduce efficiency standards, right? And so a state like California has really led the way on this. Um, with efficiency standards for fleets. One of the weird things about the US system, and one of the reasons that journalists are writing about what they sort of refer to as car bloat in the United States, right? We have these giant cars while the rest of the world's cars are actually getting smaller and smaller and more efficient, is that we have a weird legal loophole, basically, where we say, okay, we need your entire fleet on average to be less than, say, 26 and a half miles per gallon by 2030. Okay, fine. Um, we can work around that or whatever. But trucks and light SUV and trucks and SUVs don't count toward the average for some reason. They are exempted, right? And so, in order to sort of meet these standards, the U.S. producers like GM and others basically just started shelling out a whole bunch of SUVs and pickups, right? And so, our fleets have gotten sort of less efficient over time and larger, which can actually cause more deaths on the road and pedestrian deaths and things like that, while the rest of the world is sort of getting smaller and smaller, right? So, just sort of a weird exemption in our policy that has led to this sort of unwieldy giant car system, right? Okay, what's another way the government can play a role? Obviously, in strategic standards, right? So I would that add this as the third one. We obviously need energy for the military. We set standards for drilling policy and sort of strategic reserves, right? Like how much gasoline do we have in reserve in case shit hits the fan, and we need to be able to produce everything internally for a while, right? Um, we set standards on access and imports, right? Like you're not allowed to buy Russian oil right now in the United States, right? And most of the West. China has filled the gap for Russia, basically. And India is still purchasing some Russian oil. And so Trump has been sort of strong arming Narendra Modi to try to get him to stop purchasing Russian oil. So these things have very, very broad global political influences, right? And then you have things like trade and sanctions, which we were just talking about. Okay, the fourth is citizen support. So the fourth way that I could think of that the government could get involved in the energy markets and energy policy is in citizen-directed support, right? So informational campaigns, obviously, about I don't know the science of climate change or the alternatives that things like solar cells for your roof or things of that sort, right? They can also offer subsidies for efficiency. So this can be not only subsidies to, say, like research institutes or universities for research and development, which generally the U.S. leads the way, sort of technologically and research wise. Um, but it could also mean subsidies for, say, replacing your gasoline vehicle with an electric vehicle, or replacing your old washing machine with a new energy efficient machine. These sorts of things, right? Um, yeah. Okay. I guess the last thing I have to say here is we'll talk about sort of issues in developing states, right? So obviously, developing states have a little bit more difficult time with things like externalities of air pollution and industrial waste and the health issues among citizens and the labor force due to light regulation, um, due to the just massive number of facilities that are manufacturing in some of these urban areas, right? There are also things like credit or lending difficulties for these developing states. Many of these industries take enormous investments, right? So if you're talking about like a refining facility or the investments for really pulling a lot of oil out of the ground or these sorts of things. Um, and one of the problems here is that often this means that Western companies own these sort of indigenous plots, or and so many of the profits aren't actually helping the developing state; they're being funneled back into the West, right? Um, it also tends to lead to really high levels of inequality in those states. There's also a point to be made about the IMF and the World Bank, which are basically US led institutions that came out of um, the GATT system, basically, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. Um, and so the IMF and World Bank basically say to some of these states who need help, okay, well, if you want a loan or you want an extension on your payments, then you're going to be forced into what they call austerity measures, right? So you're going to have to sell off the utilities, and probably some Western company is going to come in and buy them and run them and manage them and profit from them, right? And so these sort of policies, these austerity measures that they've tried to put in place, have not only caused social problems, but um, some price gouging, foreign ownership, political problems, these sorts of things, right? And then I guess the last thing I would say is there's a lot of inequality in access in a lot of these places, right? Where a lot of states, especially developing states, are experiencing things like brownouts and blackouts quite often. I would point to a country like South Africa, who has real problems with their grid management, but then also a lot lower access for the poor and the rural, especially, right? Um, and so there are a lot of different political issues to be touched on inside of developing states as well as developed states. Uh, all right, that's all I got for you. The next one is going to be really short because I'm going to leave most of the modeling stuff up to y'all. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you soon.